So this is our first snippet for this week, which is we're gonna be covering for the snippets as a whole from 1941 after Pearl Harbor to 1948 or so. So here is the map of Europe at the time that the U.S. is entering World War II. So the Germans have annexed basically all of Central Europe, with occasional puppet states: Vichy France, Croatia, Slovakia, and Italy, which is sort of a vassal state of the Germans. They've invaded the Soviet Union. They've gone up to Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, but they have not been able to take over any of the Soviets' three major cities. But this is a huge swath of land that the Germans control. So the issue for Roosevelt, we have the Japanese have attacked the United States, and here Roosevelt has to make a critical strategic decision. Public pressure is just extraordinary on FDR, partly because, of course, the Japanese attacked the U.S., partly, I think, for racist reasons. There's this kind of surge of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States, and that goes beyond just the attack. So there's public pressure on Roosevelt to focus the efforts on the Pacific. But what Roosevelt believes correctly is that Germany, sort of see from the map, is the greater threat than Japan. He wants to focus the U.S. response on Germany, and roughly that's going to happen in World War II. Around 2/3 of the U.S. military involvement in World War II was in the European front, 1/3 in the East Asian front. But he goes to his military advisors and says, look, we've got to get into the action against Hitler pretty much at the start. And then the question is where to do so. So the first option is on the coast of France, but this is heavily fortified. Remember that map that I showed in the Q&A snippet from last Friday? There's just no way in the world that the British and the Americans are going to be able to do a cross-channel invasion into France in 1942. Churchill suggests, well, maybe we should move through the Balkans, which not coincidentally had been a British sphere of influence before World War II, try to liberate Greece and Yugoslavia and Romania. American military leaders are correctly suspicious of this as a goal. They see this as tough fighting area. And so in the end, what Roosevelt sort of falls back on is here in Northern Africa. Let's see, right down here at the bottom of the map, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, the former French colonies. And when France is divided into two as a result of the German invasion, you have this Vichy France government, which is a collaborationist pro-Nazi government ruled by French, but French who are sympathetic to Hitler, who are left at least nominally in control of the French colonial empire. And the chief Vichy officer in this region here in Northern Africa is this guy, Admiral Jean Darlan, who again was an admiral in the French Navy at the time of the German invasion of France, then stays loyal to the Vichy regime after the German capture of France. And the head of the Vichy regime, Marshal Pétain, puts Darlan in charge of French North Africa. Darlan is, he has no trouble at all going along with the Vichy government, which is an anti-Semitic government, and the Vichy government has its own Nuremberg laws applying to French Jews. They turn French Jews over to the Nazis. I mean, it's an awful regime. But Roosevelt senses, and Roosevelt's advisors sense, that North Africa might be a way to sort of get into the military action against the Germans, and they send out emissaries to Darlan and say, "Look, we're thinking of invading North Africa. Maybe let's do a deal." And the result is what's called the Darlan Deal, in which Darlan promises to instruct French troops. So these are French troops loyal to the Vichy collaborationist regime, not to resist the Americans if they land here in North Africa and in these French colonies. In exchange, Roosevelt agrees that the United States will recognize Darlan. Darlan is going to be switching sides here. Recognize Darlan rather than any of the generals who had actually resisted the German invasion and had fled into exile as the leader of the French post-war government. This is sort of doing the deal with the devil here, sort of preserving, minimizing American casualties, but again, going along with or negotiating with the guy who went along with an anti-Semitic regime. But in any case, from Roosevelt's standpoint, this deal is worth doing because it will get U.S. troops on the ground fighting German forces, immediately in 1942 in a way that they're not going to be completely wiped out. And this is a successful operation. The Americans move from the west, starting in Morocco. The British, in one of the more important battles of World War II, defeat the Nazis at El Alamein in Egypt, and then move from the east. And there's sort of a pincer into Tunisia here, right sort of at the heart of North Africa. And a combined German-Italian force is eventually withdrawn and is pushed out in 1943. And from this, the U.S. will invade Italy in 1943. So Roosevelt makes the decision: look, we want U.S. troops on the ground in North Africa. We're going to do what we can to sort of advance this cause again, even if it requires making a deal with Darlan. Darlan will be assassinated in World War II, so the U.S. never really has to sort of confront the legacy of this. This would have been just a nightmare if he had lived after World War II, and the U.S. was forced to recognize this guy as the rightful leader of France. But it is in North Africa where we see the first U.S. fighting in the European front during World War II. And this, you should realize this is sort of an expansion of U.S. interest. I mean, even in World War I, the U.S. doesn't have any troops on the ground in North Africa. And one of the themes of World War II is that it brings U.S. military power to parts of the world that previously had been beyond the U.S. Scope. All that said, the bulk of the fighting in the European front in World War II is done by the Soviets in the Eastern Front, which is a horrific war. This is a photograph of Stalingrad, where the Germans initially seem to have driven the Soviets out. The Soviets counterattack, surround the city, trap a German army inside the city. Hitler had given orders to the German army not to withdraw when they could have gotten out, and the result is that the German army is starved, eventually forced to surrender and completely wiped out. And that's the beginning of the turning of the tide on the Eastern Front. The number of casualties, the number of deaths, the severity of the fighting is far, far greater on the Eastern Front than on the Western Front throughout World War II. Now, of course, the counter to this, and the British in particular, consistently point this out to Stalin when Stalin pushes for a British-American invasion of France in 1942 or 1943 to relieve some of the pressure that the Soviets are facing. The counter to this is the British say, look, you abandoned us in 1939 when you did the Nazi-Soviet deal. We had to fight the Nazis on our own from 1939 until the summer of 1941. So it's kind of rich for you, Joseph Stalin, to now turn around and complain that you've been abandoned by the Western Allies. And I think the British were probably correct in that regard. Nonetheless, there is a kind of workable alliance. This is the big three: Joseph Stalin, FDR, and Winston Churchill, that meet periodically during the war and consider not simply military tactics, but the post-war settlement as a whole. One of the things that Roosevelt and Churchill agree on is, unlike World War I, a policy of unconditional surrender. That is, that the war will be fought until Germany has been completely conquered. And partly that's because of a sense that the Germans didn't understand they had lost World War I, and that contributed to the rise of Hitler. But partly that's a way to assure Stalin. Stalin is a paranoid, it's a way of assuring Stalin that the Western powers are not going to cut a separate deal with Hitler, and therefore he should not do so. Either. This meeting, by the way, is called it's often called a summit meeting, and the concept of summit meetings, we all now are familiar with that. It happens all the time. I remember a couple of months ago, Biden had a summit meeting with Putin, and Biden's had summit meetings with the leaders of the G7 countries. Trump did. Every American president has done this in recent years. But this idea of presidents individually meeting in these kind of diplomatic arrangements on a regular basis is really something that dates from World War II. Now, on the domestic side, World War II has a transformative effect, both in economic and social policy. In economic policy, because the federal government is spending huge sums of money. I mean, take a look at the expansion of the defense budget between 1940 and 1945. It increases by a factor of more than 40. This has the effect of, the U.S. government is purchasing all of these defense supplies. It creates new jobs, although this of course was not the intent, and it brings the United States out of the Depression. So it's an odd sort of way World War II contributes to post-war U.S. economic prosperity. The rhetoric of the United States during World War II also contributes or sort of facilitates a greater amount of egalitarianism, because the U.S. is fighting an explicitly racist power in Nazi Germany. U.S. propaganda reimagines the United States as an explicitly anti-racist country, which of course, it hardly has been. And so civil rights activists, this is A. Philip Randolph, who was a civil rights leaders of the generation before Martin Luther King, used this to sort of pressure the U.S. government to do something about anti-Black racism in the United States. And Roosevelt creates a commission called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is the first federal commission dealing with issues of workplace discrimination. Now, it's kind of an advisory body, and it's confined to government contracts, but nonetheless, symbolically, it's quite significant. And then, with regards to gender equality, one of the effects of World War II, because you have millions of men who are going off to fight, is that women move into the workforce in unprecedented numbers, which gives women a greater degree of social equality as well. And even though after this is a propaganda poster of Rosie the Riveter, the famous World War II icon. And even though women are in many ways pushed out of these industrial jobs after World War II, the experience of women in the workplace can't really be suppressed as well. So you can make an argument that World War II contributes to greater degrees of racial and gender egalitarianism in the United States, although obviously the U.S. is not an equal country for all of its citizens in 1945. That's the positive side of the social. The negative side, and this is a hugely negative side, is this decision in 1942, and the thing on the left here is the poster announcing the decision, to imprison every American of Japanese ancestry who lives in Washington State, Oregon, California, and Arizona. Ironically, not Hawaii, which had the largest percentage of Japanese Americans at the time. And the reason for this largely was political pressure from nativist forces in these states who had a long legacy of anti-Japanese racism. This is as unconstitutional policy as you could possibly imagine, but the Supreme Court upholds it in this awful decision called Korematsu versus the United States. The underlying argument here is that all Japanese are inherently suffer from a dual loyalty. That is, that they're loyal both to the United States and to the Japanese Empire. And since there's the possibility of a Japanese attack on the West Coast, they have to be removed from the West Coast for the security of the country. So they're placed in these concentration camps in barren areas in the Rocky Mountain states, in Colorado and Utah, in Nebraska and in Wyoming, imprisoned solely because of their ethnicity. The U.S. government eventually will apologize for this, but not until 1988, and it's one of the real black marks in 20th century U.S. public policy. As the war consumes, or as the war continues, diplomatic and strategic and political concerns meld, and the best example of this comes in this awful episode called the Katyn, K-A-T-Y-N, Forest Massacre. This is a photograph of a Red Cross official examining these corpses. The Katyn Forest is in what was then far eastern Poland. The Germans in 1943 discover this shallow grave containing around 20,000 former Polish officers who had last been seen in 1939 when the Soviets had invaded Poland. So these are people from the eastern sliver of Poland that the Soviets had captured. The Soviets claim that this is all a ruse, that these people were actually killed by the Germans. They were not. They were killed by the Soviets. And this creates a huge problem for the Polish government in exile. Here's the pre-war boundaries of the Polish state. Polish government in exile is anti-communist as a whole, and now there's evidence that the Soviets had killed these leading politicians, intellectuals, cultural leaders, and military officials in sort of summary executions in 1939. And the Polish government in exile, as a result, severs relations with the Soviet Union. They say we need the Soviets to acknowledge this. Stalin, of course, refuses. And the result of this is that Stalin decides that he's going to support the creation of a new Polish government, basically a communist government. That government agrees that the eastern third of Poland, the portion of Poland that was seized by the Soviet Union in 1939 as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact, that the Soviets will be able to keep that after World War II. And in exchange, Poland will be compensated with area that used to be part of Germany, and that the Germans who lived there will be kicked out. This boundary shift, of course, moves the Soviet Union closer to the center of Europe and makes Poland much less defensible against the Soviet Union as well. And this breakup of the Polish government in exile and Soviet relationship is going to preview problems with the World War II alliance and the post-war scene. The war reverses direction entirely in 1944. This is a photograph of D-Day, the joint American-British landing on the coast of France. The U.S. and British forces will gradually and effectively push back the Germans in France and Belgium and in the Netherlands, and eventually in early 1945 enter Germany itself. And on the Eastern Front, a series of offensives in late 43 and early 44 by the Red Army drives the Germans back in the Baltic states, in Poland, and also sees the Red Army sweeping into the Balkans, into Romania, into Hungary and Bulgaria. These are countries that had been allied with the Germans, and they very quickly switch sides as soon as the Red Army comes in. So by the end of 1944, it's clear that the war is going to end with an Allied victory. The question just is sort of how that victory is going to take shape. And that's it for our first snippet.